We may as well make a start. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. This, as you have seen from the introduction, is one of several events that various different APPGs are organising, looking at what the fallout, consequences, exciting opportunities provided by the AI Safety Summit will be. We'll hear from a number of people in a minute with interesting perspectives on it. One of the things, talking to people who were at Bletchley, is how much of it nominally was about safety, but how much of it ended up being about the future of work. So it is a good time to be talking about those two linked issues, and I think it remains the case that almost any conversation about artificial intelligence ends up being a conversation about the future of work very quickly, whether we like it or not. So we're just ahead of the curve when it comes to all of that. Jim, do you want to say anything else? I am running away just before 5 o'clock, so this is a tag team operation. But if you want to say anything now, feel free.
Thank you, Matt. Not much to add. I know we've got a few people who are also joining online, so they're equally welcome. I'm just bravely hoping that they can hear us. But
lovely.
You're really welcome.
Good. They can. Excellent. They are delighted. We are delighted. So we've got fantastic thoughts from Connected by Data, Tech UK, Ada Lovelace, Promising Trouble, and we will have Chloe Smith later on at about 4:30, I think. But I will start. I'll work down this way. So if we start with Jenny from Connected by Data, apparently we're going to get 3 minutes each. I'll believe it when I see it. So Jenny.
Thank you. So I'm Jenny Tenson. I'm the CEO at Connected by Data, which is a campaign for communities to have a powerful voice in data and AI. So we were told to do 3 points in our 3 minutes. So my 3 points are: this really matters to people. The scope of AI at work needs to be broad, and we need to think about that. And it really matters who's in the room when we're making decisions around data and AI. So to talk about how this matters to people, there was a survey during Summit Week reported by Labour Together about what was actually important to people around particularly generative AI, and top of the list was misinformation, but second and third was jobs, employment, and the impact of AI on work. But we also, Connected by Data, ran a people's panel on AI, a small mini public deliberating on AI and the impacts that it has and the kind of recommendations that they would have for people working in this area. And I'll quote them verbatim. One of their recommendations was as follows. We need a safe transition with training to support people into the world of work with AI, ensuring no one is left behind. This could include, they said, a tax pot dedicated to training and reskilling funded by employer contributions. That was one of the things this deliberative panel came out with. So first point, this really does matter to people. It's kind of 7 recommendations that they came out with this deliberative panel. Second thing is that we need to think carefully about the scope of AI at work. I think when we talk about generative AI and the kind of focus that the summit had on frontier AI and foundation models and those kinds of things, we often think of the new impact on creative workers, on knowledge professionals and so forth. But we mustn't forget the existing impacts that AI is having at work. So on performance monitoring, on tasking, particularly in the gig economy, on things like fraud detection, as we saw with the post office scandal, on robo firing in the hiring system and so on. Right? There's a bunch of ways in which AI is currently having an impact on work, and we mustn't lose sight of them in particular. But we also should be paying attention to the way that the workers in the AI supply chain. So that includes people who are labeling data, often on very low wages. And we have to bear in mind that the quality of their work will be impacted by their working conditions, and therefore the quality of the AI that we get to benefit from will be impacted by their working conditions. We also need to think about workers in tech companies. While we're putting all of this kind of controls around the way in which AI is developed, there's a really strong role for tech worker unionisation, making sure that there are good whistleblowing policies in place and so on, so that any workers within that supply chain can address safety concerns when they see them. So let's not forget about them as well. And then my final point is that it really matters who's in the room. Although the discussions at the AI Safety Summit may have talked about work, that wasn't part of what came out of the communique. It wasn't part of the Bletchley Declaration or part of the summaries from the working groups that were talked about. So, and notably, there were worker representatives in the room at the summit itself. So I think that perspective probably wasn't brought out to the extent that it could have been. Also need to, and when I say it matters who's in the room, these decisions aren't just made at that kind of international level, they're made at a national level and they're made at a workplace level. So, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill that is going through Parliament at the moment includes removing a clause that encourages consultation with those affected by data and AI in the workplace. So I think that we need to make sure that workers are in the room and their representatives are in the room when these decisions are being made, both at the kind of policy level and when it comes to that the adoption of AI in the workplace itself. Obviously, I could go on for a lot longer, but those are my 3 points. This matters to people. Let's make sure we still keep a broad scope of AI, not just get carried away with generative AI. And it really matters who's in the room, so let's make sure that workers are represented there.
Nimi.
Hi everyone, I'm Nimi Patel. I'm the Head of Skills, Talent and Diversity at Tech UK, which is a tech trade association with over 1,000 tech businesses in our ecosystem. I sit within the skills policy team alongside my colleague Jake Wall, who couldn't be here today, but he's joining us online. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to throw at him, not me. My points are really about sort of skills development and talent naturally. And, ahead of the summit, government announced a 118 million package pot to grow skills in AI. And I think that's something that everyone in this room is quite thankful for, something that we would want. And it's something that we at Tech UK have highlighted in our Making AI Work for Britain report as to be crucial. What was interesting that came out of that package was the idea of creating a newly dedicated visa scheme for the world's most talented AI researchers to come to the UK for internship placements early in their tech careers to encourage them to stay. This is fantastic, but the UK has one of the highest cost visa systems in the world, and that's only increased. So in October, it increased by 15% for the skilled worker route and 35% for the graduate routes or sort of routes for students. That's on the cost it was before. It's clear that these policies are really great, but the narrative around these policies need to be better so that people feel encouraged to come to the UK. So that was my first point. I saw that and I thought, oh, amazing. Will anyone use the visa? Will anyone want to? How can we encourage them to do so? My second point is really around post-summit, what happens next. And I think Jenny has covered, it fantastically. But from our side, it's about giving businesses the confidence to invest in tech that they can trust. And we've made a number of different recommendations on how that should be, but essentially sort of clarifying the laws, the AI law, and looking at bias mitigation in the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill will be really crucial to doing so. And we have a number of different ways to do so, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion after. That was my second point. And my third point is a really interesting question that Anna actually proposed to us about the language of AI safety. And this is a question I posed to the room as well, about the fact that AI safety is almost risk-first language. AI for good might be more appropriate, but I really would like to hear everyone else's thoughts on that as well.
One of Lord Cameron's, the AI Minister's challenges is, can we find a better way of saying dual-use technologies? His answer so far is no, but he is open to suggestions. Matt from Ada Lovelace, go for it.
Thanks, and thanks to APPG for having me here today. My name is Matt Davis. I'm the UK Public Policy Lead at the Ada Lovelace Institute. We're an independent research institute with a mission to make data and AI work for people and society. So the first thing I'd like to say is that we really welcome the government's commitment to driving AI safety forward, notwithstanding qualms about the terminology. It's not perfect, as Jenny's acknowledged, but seeing almost 30 global governments acknowledge in the Bletchley Declaration that AI is already transforming daily life and that the companies developing those systems have in some form an obligation to ensure they're safe, that's a huge step forward from where we were a few years ago or even this time last year. But yes, it's not perfect and it's certainly not yet mission accomplished. So there are three things, I've got my three things in, we'd like to see government to do to build on the momentum around AI policy at the moment. And the first is building institutional capacity. The AI Safety Institute has been announced to build on the work that's been done over the last few months by the Frontier AI Task Force. We think the devil will be in the detail of how this is set up. It's imperative that it's politically independent and it can take a long-term view without interference from either the government of the day or from industry. And it will need to incorporate the expertise not only of technical specialists, but also of social scientists, humanities scholars, and others, and the voices of the public, which Jenny's mentioned and which I'll come to. You know, there are some really good existing models for how this can work. We think the Committee on Climate Change might be a compelling one to look at, and we're hoping to publish more on this soon. But the second thing we think needs to happen is broadening the debate, which was a key theme both at Bletchley and at the AI Fringe that happened in parallel. You know, to properly understand and address the harms that are already occurring from AI, we need to meaningfully involve people and communities, particularly those most affected by the development and use of AI systems. There are really great examples out there already of participatory and deliberative processes, citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, people's panels, as Jenny and Connected by Data have shown us, that are being used to do this in AI and other policy areas. So there are examples that can be taken off the shelf and adapted. But finally, last but certainly not least, we need hard regulation, and we need it, quite frankly, we need it yesterday. Investment in improving our understanding of AI capabilities and the potential harms that could arise from these dual-use technologies is really welcome. I can't stress that enough. But we also urgently need to bring in laws to tackle those harms that are already well understood. There are many of them, you know, and we also understand a lot of the solutions as well. Government published a fantastic document alongside the summit with a whole host of mitigations, but they don't have any legal force. There are no incentives actually for countries to be adopting them at present. And look, there's a legislative vehicle for this already before Parliament. Jenny's mentioned it, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. Now, at present, certain aspects of the bill we think are going in the wrong direction, and we think it needs to be strengthened to provide better oversight in a number of areas. Biometric technologies, such as live facial recognition, which are going to underpin many of the most cutting-edge AI systems that we're already seeing rolled out and will continue to see over the coming years. But also automated decision-making safeguards, which again Jenny's alluded to, including in the workplace. And again, you know, we think, depending on what's in scope for the bill, it could potentially be a vehicle for incentivising companies to adopt some of the responsible AI practices that government has talked about. So there's an opportunity here to use this bill to deliver on the promises made at the summit. We'd really like to see parliamentarians take up that mantle. So I'll leave it there for now because I'm pretty sure I'm over my 3 minutes, but I'm happy to go into more detail on any of that.
Miraculous that we are ahead of schedule at this stage. But anyway, Rachel, promising trouble.
Hi there. So we ran an alternative event in the week of the summit, and we convened 150 people from across civil society to come and create an alternative agenda for Bletchley. Because one of the things, you know, that I'm really happy about is that the outcome included a recognition that harms in daily life are happening and need to be recognised. But the idea that we would have to go through such a confrontational process in order to make that happen seems both extraordinary and problematic. And I think that work is a really good lens to look at how AI is changing our lives, right? Because the thing is, a lot of the things that are happening are very boring, mundane. They're not fantastical, extraordinary ones. They're things like supermarket self scans. It's things, you know, it's not. I think there's an extent to which, when we're talking about technology in rooms like this, we want to talk about the amazing, fantastical, magical, but actually a lot of it is very everyday. So my next point is that actually I think, you know, as long as I've been around technology regulation, one of the things I see a lot is that technologists like making new rules. That there's no idea that the rules that are there work for them. And, you know, I was very, very saddened to see that there was no real acknowledgement of human rights coming out of Bletchley, and that actually the social impacts that have been commissioned are not based on rights, they're based on a sort of technocratic framework that somebody's made up. And that actually, if we want to move ahead together, then we need to do that based on the best that we have. So human rights feels like an important place to start. And I think the last thing I would say, you know, having spent a day with experts and people with lived experience ranging across education, justice, work, warfare, if we can't draw on the expertise that is there to look at the harms that are unrolling now, then actually we doomed. Like, that is the doom, to begin again, and to begin again in a frame that is solely made by technology companies, I think is anti-democratic. And so, while overall I grudgingly say that I welcome the moment, right, and I welcome the forcing moment of everybody coming together, I wish it had happened in a more consultative, deliberative way. And I think, you know, I really hope there's an opportunity to move on from there now. Thank you.
I'm going to shamelessly abuse the position of the chair, but we can come to questions in a minute. I suppose the pushback from the government would be to say that this was a summit that was firmly aimed at a sort of overtly elitist group. It's 110 people in the room. It is the foundation for consultation with wider groups rather than the consultative event itself. So how can we influence the Safety Institute to do that consultation in a way that looks effective? Because there's not a lot of point at this stage whinging about what summit was. It's what does the future look like? I wonder if people have any thoughts on what success would look like for the Safety Institute.
Before anyone answers, this is a really old-fashioned thing to say, but we are in the House of Lords. We're not allowed to have people taking photographs in or filming in here. It's just against the rules, and especially if they're then shared, then the breaking of the rules is exposed and we get into trouble. So if you can respect that, I'd really appreciate it.
He gets it. Any thoughts on the Safety Institute and what good looks like for them?
Sure. So let me think. I think, first of all, there's an issue about the scope of the AI Safety Institute, just as there was an issue around the scope of the summit itself. And having early consultation around scope would help to make that scope be broad enough, as Rachel has talked about and Matt's talked about, like the bringing in those kind of daily, everyday kind of harms into the scope of what's looked at by the Safety Institute. And I think that as part of that, bringing in civil society groups, bringing in public to the conversation is really important. particularly as I suspect that the AI Safety Institute may take on more of a regulatory function, potentially, then it becomes even more important to have those governance functions incorporate a wide set of stakeholders in the shaping of scope and the way in which it operates. So I think, it's a wide consultation, I think, is the thing that would help to make it.
I mean, the other thing that Rachel's point made me think in lots of ways is that there are lots of issues where we already have legislation. And in some ways, it's really important to keep the scope of the Safety Institute quite limited to the new things that are AI, so that we can very clearly say there's lots of things that are already covered, and you don't get to discriminate just because the computer made a decision. So yeah, interesting. Anyone else have any other thoughts before I go to the floor?
I mean, just on that point, I think it's a really interesting one, and it comes down to how does this play with the kind of wider kind of plan for regulation that the government has set out with its white paper. And actually, if you look at that approach, it's delegating responsibility for AI regulation to different sectoral regulators to ensure that, there's none that doubling up that you've alluded to. But actually, the Safety Institute it's been set out to basically have an information sharing function, right, between government, between regulatory organisations, and between developers of these models, right? So, one way of looking at success is actually furnishing regulators in particular sectors who don't have the technical expertise and certainly aren't able to audit or evaluate, a leading foundation model. Are they able to almost be a one-stop shop and provide those regulators with the information they need? That would be one measure of success, I think.
Yeah.
I'd add. So at the moment, the makeup of the Safety Institute doesn't reflect a lot of the expertise that we have in the country as a whole. It draws on a very narrow sliver, and again, I think there is a focus on newness, and that actually over the last decade, lots of great work has happened. And maybe not being implemented. So that's something really easy to do. It's like we don't have to make up everything again. But the other thing I think that is a real challenge, which I think the Safety Institute needs to think strongly on, is that not every technology is a new technology. Not every impact is new. And so technologies that we've been living with over years and years, as they become more complex or more widely used, they begin to create new harms. And that actually, if we're only looking at putting things out the door, we're missing out on what's happening in the world. And so I think what we really need is not only consultation, but a process of horizon scanning, sensing, understanding, and then importantly, redress. So that if people have an issue, they know where to go. It isn't only about something happens, you don't know who is responsible for the thing that has happened, and you let it go. And so I think, it's just important to remember that technologies almost live in the world with us, and they aren't made whole the minute they're deployed.
Interesting. Anyone in the audience with questions, thoughts, comments, or indeed on Teams? Although there are no faces, there are only initials.
We'll wait for their textual contributions on Teams, yeah. Please, yeah.
Hi there, I'm Natasha McCarthy. I'm from the Royal Academy of Engineering, the UK's National Academy of Engineering. I had a couple of points, but one I wanted to make actually really follows from what Rachel just said, which is that in the sort of fringe activities, in some of the fringe conversations and some of the conversations I've been part of since, it's spoken about as if AI is a technology that has come and has landed, and we've got to figure out what to do with it and how to use it. And my thought is that technology is a human activity. Building technology is human activity. And notwithstanding the fact we have to think about how we take a scientific approach to developing AI, to testing AI, to ensuring it works well, it's not like discovering a virus or discovering something that's out there in the world. It's something that we make and we can change it. And also, if we feel like we've gone down the wrong route, we can stop. So I feel like there's a sense that we need to think about this technology as something that we own and shape. And I went into the summit thinking about the importance of engineering skills, because engineers have great knowledge in how we build technology so that it's safe, we build in the safety cases, we know how to work with regulators. And I heard people talking about aviation and cars in that light, right? We built these to be safer and safer and safer. But they create an existential threat. They are dependent on fossil fuels. We built them in such a way that we are locked into using them a lot and locked into using them in a certain way. So what I take from that is the fact that we have choices about how we develop these technologies. We need to ensure we have a diverse and inclusive ecosystem of companies working on them so that we can row back from any kind of ways of using the technologies that turn out to be more harmful than we thought about. And that we're therefore creating more and different jobs in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, and not locking in too much. So I think that point that this is a technology, we can engineer it, we need those engineering skills, but we also need to think about this as a technology that should be kept as diverse as possible so we have the resilience and we can switch modes if we do see that harms emerge over time. So yeah, really interesting reflection so far. Thank you very much.
One of the analogies that was used at the summit was when we first invented radio, they were valve radios and you needed to be really protective, and the first thought that people had was how do you put cushions around valves and make them somehow more robust? And actually the solution to getting radio widespread was to invent the transistor radio. And it's actually a sort of a slightly more, we've gone down one road, it doesn't mean it's the perfect road, and how do you try and get there? There was another hand somewhere. My lord.
Yeah, it's difficult to know where to begin really on all of this. I mean, the worry is that there's so much hype around the summit. And, you know, 5 years ago in our AI Select Committee, we were talking about risk, and all the summit seems to have done is kind of have an extended discussion about risk without willing the means to mitigate it. And the one piece of legislation that is in front of us at the moment, which, as our panel have said, is going backwards. I mean, the Article 22 watering down is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. So I was just going to say, Matt, my question would be, what support can we get for Jim and I to thoroughly sort out the DPDI bill when it finally arrives? Because so much of it, and it's not just that bit that's watering down our rights under GDPR. There are all kinds of other areas, litigation interest, personal data definition, you name it. I mean, it's a thoroughly bad bill, and I contrast it with the Digital Markets Bill, which unfortunately it has the threat of being watered down, but at least it's got most of the right ingredients. But this, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, really is going in, I mean, post-summit, it's a scandal, actually, that it's going forward in the way that it is, because instead of having listened to civil society on what was the fringe of the summit, okay, they didn't appear, sadly. I wish people like Ada Lovelace had been able to have a proper platform, for instance, but instead of that, we've got this bill which has not changed post-summit. And my ambition is to thoroughly mess it up and make sure...
Fix it, Tim. Fix it. Mess it up.
Mess it up. Well, short of fixing it, mess it up. If we can't fix it, Jim, and you know how difficult it is to win on ping pong and so on at the end of the day, but at least put a lot of markers down so that any future government, whatever that may be, actually listens and really pledges itself to getting us in a proper state on our data. I mean, you know, public trust is absolutely crucial, and we see all around. We see in healthcare, you know, we see in so many other areas where there's a lack of trust, and nobody's doing anything to fix it.
Has the government, this is a genuine question, has the government made an attempt to explain why it's taking the approach that it's taking in a way that is sort of meaningful engagement?
Pro-innovation and context-specific, which it covers a multitude of sins and means you have a complete patchwork quilt, a balkanized version for some mythical entrepreneur who wants to develop some new product and feels that they might be possibly affected by some regulation. I mean, I believe that good regulation encourages innovation And that's what we should be doing good things.
Everyone says that. They just have different ideas of what good regulation is.
Precisely. But I don't necessarily accept the fact you have to have a massive horizontal layer of regulation. I believe in gap analysis. If your equality law is correct, that's fine. If your data protection law is fine. But in certain areas of artificial intelligence, there are no duties, for instance, of explainability or transparency. The black box is still going to be a big problem unless you say you design up front for it to be transparent. So there are all kinds of things we can do. Liability and accountability isn't clear. So if you do a basic gap analysis, you can see that actually there's a huge amount even then we need to do without doing other things which people might regard as being too European in their nature, although I'm rather fond of the AI Act as a place to start, quite honestly.
Although as you know, the government isn't, so there will be a divergence of approach.
Of course, and the more we diverge, the worse it is for our AI developers.
Adam Barty, Global Head of Purpose and Impact at Simmons & Simmons, where I'm here wearing multiple hats and representing my own views, I should add. I couldn't help but want to add to the conversation that seems to have mentioned right a number of times without maybe just drawing together a few strands which I think are worthy of explicitly making connections between, even though implicitly I'm sure we're all there. Which is like, there is a huge opportunity, of course there is, through the modernisation of work practices for efficiencies. If you take the justice sector, which I work in extensively, the ability to maybe potentially deliver justice to a whole swathe of society that otherwise is excluded. However, there is a genuine gap, and I think, Natasha, your comments sparked this thought, between what we're developing and what we think we have at hand and actual genuine problems of planet and people that could be solved. There is enough to be getting on with to solve in a way that actually would be incredibly beneficial and contribute positively. But one might say, well, there's so many problems. How do we define which problems? There's at least 2 of us in this room wearing the UN Global Compact SDG badge. The world has sort of already defined those big problems for us. We could possibly start there and actually, not being facetious, but to come back to the fundamental driver between the SDGs, and actually much of the comments, Tim, that you've just made, is actually to start at a rights-based system. And I think the charter, the institute...
Well, you gave evidence to our original select committee.
Indeed.
So, and we took it all on board.
But it's incredibly important that we put that at the heart of both conversations about work, both conversations about safety, and also actually if you're going to design for regulation, she says as someone who's regulated her entire life, maybe start with fundamental rights first and build up from there. And then we can have horizontal that actually is effective.
I can just add to that. So there's, I was until September non-exec at Ofcom looking at the online safety bill and its passage through. And I think we need to learn a lot from what has happened there, which, you know, that's a fundamentally risk-based approach, which I think is pushing harms down the line. You know, the Act is now enforced, but everybody has 1,700 pages of consultation document to read, because the ins and outs of risk-based are so complicated, whereas actually I think a rights-based lends itself to anticipatory governance. And I think anticipatory governance is really needed as a principle, but there doesn't seem to be any political backing for that at the moment.
Whatever principles we'd had, Ofcom would still have issued a 1,700-page consultation, but that's a separate issue. Gentlemen.
Hi, my name's Jamie. I don't know if this is the right platform for this. I've run an IT business or a number of IT businesses for the last 20 years, and I'm a human. So I come at this, I also have a deep interest in psychotherapy, and what really worries me, talking about the safety building in the school, this is what worries me about AI, is that we still haven't stopped kids looking at porn online. We still haven't stopped the damage which a lot of social media is doing to kids in terms of stress and anxiety and all this type of thing. AI is going to add a whole new dimension to this. the ability for humans, us and kids, our kids, to talk to AIs, both by chatting and talking, the impact that that's going to have on them, and the impact that that's going to have on their ability to have relationships moving forward, I think is a massive concern. And I never hear anything about that. I hear about the big companies, I hear about the kind of safety, but I'm so sceptical about how the government handles that when I see that they can still do all these things online, they still have.
If I can just respond briefly. The Online Safety Act literally just got roller sent. It will take probably a couple of years for us to feel the impact, but I do think it's an improvement on where we were. I do think it will make children much safer online. I do think it'll make it really hard for them to access porn online, for example. It just will take a while, and it'll be a phased implementation of that. Nevertheless, I have sympathy with some of your other concerns and scepticism, and I worry when I listened to the Minister, Viscount Camrose, yesterday in our chamber, Tim and I, essentially saying he saw no reason for regulation at the moment because he's waiting to see evidence of harm. I think from this conversation we can sense that there is harm already. You know, Jenny talked about the importance of thinking about what's happening right now in the workplace and the impact of AI in the workplace, not just what might happen in the future. And there are issues now that we need to be thinking about just in the context of work.
Does anyone else have any quick questions? Because I'm keen to get to Chloe as soon as humanly possible. Can I suggest shamelessly that we cut to Chloe and then you can intersperse stuff that comes out of that into second question, because we do have a little while. Anna, over to you.
We're very grateful for you coming. Thank you very much. Welcome to our session. I thought perhaps I would pick out some points that have been made by our panel.
Very helpful.
Knowing that, yes, in order that you can choose which you wish to respond to. The first, perhaps starting with the kind of systems meta and then going down to some specific points in that order. Firstly, something that we've heard more than once is, what does safety actually mean? And does it and should it? And there is a I think consensus among the panelists that it should, because it's inextricably linked to it, include public good. And could that, I'm looping it now together with something we've heard from the audience already, include good work. We've had reference, for example, to the Institute for the Future Work's Good Work Charter. So that bears very specifically on the scope of the AI Institute at the moment. The second, perhaps, point is, how can we build our institutional capacity in the United Kingdom? That there seems to be a need to think about building that in different ways: physical, digital, connectivity, communication infrastructures, where there are gaps through the tech life cycle in terms of dissemination. So all of that in relation to the focus on responsible AI in the public good, and also in relation to building the conditions in which that can all sort of take place. The third, I think, main theme is about the need to clarify, in some respects, existing law, but also move as soon as we reasonably can. This is at least from, I think, 3 panelists, and I'll be corrected if I've got that wrong, towards hard law, as well as softer law. And including, in particular, we've heard from the panel, the incorporation of rights and human rights, that this already exists. So we need to think of a way of incorporating that as we build up towards horizontal regulation. And the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill has got a flagging more than once, because it would be, with regard to making sure that it's moving in this direction. So moving in the direction of consultation and inclusive. Yes, it is, and that it would be an opportunity to correct and sort of redirect some of these key themes that are coming up. You know, inclusivity, diversity, consultation. and possibly even incentivizing responsible AI if the political will was there.
Okay. Well, I mean, thank you so much, Anna, for taking the time to give me that update. I appreciate being given a quick thread of what's been in the room, so forgive me for not having been able to join you at 4 o'clock. I had constituency meetings. Just by way of brief introduction to me, Chloe Smith, MP for Norwich North, and earlier this year, Secretary of State of the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. I stress I am no longer that, so I am afraid I am not here to be your government representative / punchbag in the afternoon. That's not my role anymore, but I am nonetheless actually very, very interested in these things and glad that you have not only this group, but also this sort of broader inquiry and reflective session. Whilst I was in that hot seat in April through to July, I worked with the Prime Minister to set off the summit, to begin it, to design it, to get it going. I'm talking about the AI Safety Summit, of course, that we had just 2 weeks ago. And we did that for a number of reasons, which have been made very clear, of course, by now on the global stage. But just to sort of echo a few of them, we thought it was particularly important that there was a role that the UK could and should play. And I think that's been borne out actually very much by the achievements of that summit and the way in which there was absolutely response and appetite to the UK being able to lead the work that it did. That thinking then sharpened and took focus in terms of safety at the frontier, because it became clear that there was something of a space there, a gap, if you like. Which actually Michelle Donlan, I think, has very well articulated, more recently, that others have done a great deal of good work. This is situated in the context of a great deal of multilateral work and work that will continue internationally, but also throughout the private sector and the public sector, and all of those need to continue to collaborate together. But that there was specifically a need for work on the safety at the frontier. So the AI Summit has I think, been broadly a big success. I'm very proud to see it happen and to see what has come out. Anna and I most recently then worked together at the fringe that went alongside it. And I think this is where I just wanted to sort of draw that scene setting into today's room. It's been so important to broaden that conversation. It has been absolutely vital, and it will continue to be absolutely vital, to have an inclusive conversation, a debate, indeed even a national conversation about what we want from this technology, what our anxieties are about this technology, what the opportunities are in this technology. Naturally, that will continue to involve certainly the public sector, and I hear your point in your recap, Anna, that safety is a public concern, is a public interest. Of course it is, and you look to your government, of course, to keep you, to keep a level of security and to keep a level of safety. So naturally, it's something that's in the public domain there, and that has this kind of democratic accountability operating on it. But this must then also include, of course, the private sector, where a great deal of the work and the progress is taking place, and that's to be expected. I'm glad we have the AIRR taking off in Bristol, but it's, I think, fairly evident that will not be, for a while, doing quite the same things as is occurring in the frontier, in the private sector. So public must work with private to be able to understand, to be able to evaluate, to be able to set guardrails, and also I think to bring in this sense then of accountability as consumers that many of us will also have. We'll crave we will crave accountability, not have accountability. We will want it as citizens, democratically, but we will also want it as consumers. And both of those things will be true at once and will be perhaps slightly complex as it all gets underway. I wanted also then just to shout out to the need for a continuing conversation using civil society, drawing on the value and the expertise that comes, and I'm absolutely confident that includes the audience this afternoon. The final thing I just wanted to say, and I'll just put this perhaps as a point of discussion that no doubt will then go on to, is that balance between opportunity and risk. Everybody in this room probably will have a very slightly different opinion on where exactly you wish to balance opportunity versus risk in your own personal sort of appetites.
I take the view that we have a great deal of opportunity from this technology, and indeed it's already all around us. Anybody who used, a mapping function to get here today has already used it. Anybody who's recently had a reasonably sophisticated piece of hospital diagnostics treatment has probably already benefited from AI, and I think that is a good thing. I want to see more of that. I also have a level of excitement about some of the shifts it will bring and some of the opportunities, the additional opportunities it will afford in the labour market in terms of the future of work. I don't take the view that that's only a negative issue. I take the view that there's opportunity there. But naturally, this all comes alongside, I think, a great deal of anxiety, quite understandably, and that's why we have this conversation. That's why we should be debating these points, and that's why all of those sectors must come together to do so, because this is comprehensive and complex.
Comprehensive and complex. Both fronts. Happy to bring the audience back in. I wonder if the panelists that we've heard from had any other thoughts on that or the conversation more generally.
Yeah, I'd love to bring in more of the kind of insight from actually having, real people living normal lives talking about this during the People's Panel on AI that we ran during the summit week. There were two things that I particularly wanted to bring out. One was picking up on some of the stuff that Natasha was saying, and also you've talked about, Chloe, if we could put our vision of the lives that we want to lead and the way in which we want our societies to run as the first thing, and then technology in support of what that looks like. That's one of the things that the panel came out with very early on. It was like they seem to just be talking about technology and thinking technology is going to lead us into this future. Can't we lead us into this future and have technology support us in building the future that we want? So that flip of really thinking about what our vision is for the future that we want to build and how AI can support that, I think is really important for getting this, for getting people behind this. And the second thing that I wanted to bring out about it was that, as I said, these were normal people from across the country. And they came in being very anxious and not really knowing much about AI and technology, and being quite scared, frankly, about what it was going to mean for their lives. They learned a huge amount during the 3 days of watching a lot of AI fringe sessions and talking to a lot of experts, and came to understand all of AI's, or a lot of AI's flaws, and the kind of, talking about how it's made by people and therefore it builds in those kinds of biases and so forth. And as a result, were more enthusiastic about it, wanted to know more, wanted to build it into their work, wanted to talk about it and keep up to date with it. I think that we worry about how people are going to react, but actually as we give people power to think that they are going to be able to control how this technology gets brought into their lives, into their workplaces, into their schools, into hospitals, that is the way to help make them feel empowered and also give them confidence to be optimistic about the benefits that the technology can bring. So yeah, just a couple of lessons out of the People's Panel on AI. Happy to share more information about it, but I thought was really interesting seeing that impact from real people.
If I may, Jenny, I would just add that yesterday I met with people who are rolling out job design labs, who are pulling together people in disadvantaged communities. Yeah. They're broadly arrived very scared of AI because it's specifically a job design lab, as the name says, using technology. But by being introduced to the technology in different ways, they start to feel empowered by it and about it, and start to see things that were previously inconceivable to them that they then might be able to do in the world of work. And I do think there's something really important to think about in terms of how we could scale those sorts of things and engage people with that opportunity whilst engaging them around risk and safety too.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I guess firstly, I think something that's really important to underscore is about how this all fits together, because we can talk about, in the context of the data protection bill, for example, earlier, Europe's AI Act came up. And I think it can be harmful in a way to get into the kind of AI Act versus UK approach. I don't think it's about that. I think it's about actually the internal consistency of the system that the government is trying to set up, because it's all interlinked. And actually, if you look at the approach set out in the white paper on AI regulation, sure, it's a risk-based approach, but actually, to work effectively, it needs, as we already heard, proper redress, it needs proper contestability. In fact, those are two of the 5 principles. They're one principle, technically. It gets a bit confusing. And to have that, you need strong underpinning of rights, right? We commissioned independent legal analysis earlier this year from law firm AWO that found that actually the existing legal kind of underpinnings for redressing contestability when you're affected by AI harms, whether you're wrongfully fired at work or denied shifts, you're denied a mortgage or a loan product, for example, are insufficient, and the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill are making that worse, right? So government policy is kind of pulling in 2 directions on this. So I really stress that point. It's about this internal consistency and not kind of EU versus UK. And again, as I said before, I think the AI Safety Institute needs to be seen in that context as well. I think Chloe was obviously right to say that this issue of frontier AI is, in a sense, a separate domain or subdomain, and there are important issues there that need to be explored. But ultimately, the information and findings gleaned by the AI Safety Institute will need to be brought to bear in applied context, right? And we need to be thinking about how they'll work with regulators and other organisations, such as trade unions and consumer groups and so on, that are involved in those redress processes. And then finally, to the point about kind of, I guess, not AI not being an inevitability, I think it's really important to underscore the lack of certainty we have about what might happen in terms of AI development in the next few years. Actually, if you look at what the leading foundation model developers are doing, OpenAI or Google or Meta, it's not magic. They're quite established techniques, but it's premised on kind of this ever-growing need for data, for compute. It's really not clear how sustainable that trajectory is, whether it's going to continue to yield developments. And actually, a figure I find staggering is that on current trends, certain predictions have the global need for the cost of compute globally outstripping the entire US GDP by 2037, which is only 14 years away, scarily. That's manifestly not economically sustainable, right? And certainly it won't be environmentally sustainable either. So I think we need to, plan for a future in which AI could be fundamental and underpin large space of our economy, but it's certainly not a certainty.
Yeah, I would add, I think, 2 different things. So I was really interested in the thought about what the role of the UK is and how we might establish that. And something about the idea that we always have to be leading on something is maybe, it may not always be the most productive, practical approach, because actually what is important here is collaborative policy making and agreements and supporting some of the countries who weren't in the room or who were underrepresented. And that I think turning this into another arms race is maybe not the most important role that we could play. And I think the other thing that I would caution against is if we think about any technology only in the frame of risk and opportunity, we miss out, as Jenny was talking about, the world that people want, and that actually not everything is a trade-off, not everything has to be, and articulating technological policy making as a trade-off, I think, will lead to harms and inequalities, and it would be really, I think, compelling to have that addressed and help people to understand that technology doesn't have to happen to them, it can happen with them, or they can be making it themselves. Thank you.
So you want to come back on any of that?
No, I'm very much listening and enjoying the debate. Thank you.
I mean, the thing that struck me in some ways is that all the talk of collaboration is great, at some point you're going to get to some whacking great labour disputes, aren't you? Like this, inevitably, the management's right to manage will butt up against the collaborative ambitions of workers, and how we manage that process is going to be. I'm not sure I'm optimistic enough to think it's going to be seamless.
Well, I think there's an argument that if you institutionalize these processes, as you've seen in other countries, Germany, for example, or Scandinavian countries, you actually have less confrontational models of resolving those disputes.
Higher productivity sometimes as well.
Well, exactly. So, actually doing this in AI could be a way to model that and do that better and actually model for the rest of the economy.
Interesting. The fact that I'm going at 5 o'clock does not reflect my views of any current speaker.
Oh gosh. So I'm Victoria Speed. I'm from the Employment Legal Advice Network, which is a Trust for London funded network, and we work with voluntary sector who provide employment advice across London. And I was it's a bit of a question really, is when are we going to stop talking about the future of work and talk about the current work? Because we're sort of very focused in our network on this principle of everyone should be in good work and what that means in terms of minimum standards and security in life and so on. We think that should mean access to justice in terms of right and understanding of those rights, but also access to those rights. And we think that should mean properly enforced rights. So well-funded single enforcement body, for example, would be amazing. But what we're seeing currently, and I think I've been attending these events for the last 6 months, is an increase already amongst our network of people coming in who haven't ever met a single human in their work relationship. So they leave before they've got 2 years, because guess what? That it's not a very pleasant experience, but then they lose the rights that already exist. So let alone any future rights, they just leave without them. We've got Deliveroo yesterday in the news because guess what? Because they want the substitution right. It means that a young person who was under 18 took the substitution right of somebody else, paid for that, and unfortunately lost his life whilst working for the Deliveroo. And we have apps being developed all the time offering fun access to shifts in the hospitality sector, which basically means that people will be all over the place doing those shifts without gaining basic rights in holiday pay, in pension contributions, and things that actually should really matter. So I'm always a little bit confused about where we're at with this, because this is the reality that we're seeing on a daily basis, and these people that would love to be here, I think, but can't because they're out filling their fun shifts in hospitality and Deliveroo. So I just wanted to make the point for them.
I'm very much with you on the single enforcement body, but that is a whole.
I'll quote you for that.
And there's Jim, who is probably also in favour of single enforcement body. Thank you ever so much, and apologies.
Thanks very much, Matt. Yes.
Maybe I'll let the lady there because I've already spoken.
I see one. Are you sure?
You go, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm Professor Phoebe Moore. I work at the University of Essex as a professor of management and futures of work because endless possibilities. So my points are taking into account the AI Act, and I think one of the issues around why there has been a stall, and it took quite a long time to get to the final point, which is where we finally are. And then my critique is that the way that it's written is that it's a product safety. And so I think once you start to kind of put so much onus on the technology itself, then you come across potential issues. Now, safety is important, but I'm not completely clear why we're not using other kinds of bodies and corpus of law, which is, for example, health and safety. And there's a reason why I would bring that up at the APPG and the future of work. I think that's quite clear. And just to sort of look at why the product safety model doesn't work very well is because the nature of the technology itself is such that the ex ante doesn't really operate in principle or in practice when you're doing policy writing, because you've got a generative nature. I mean, the predictive dimensions around, for example, with product safety by design, when you have a car, then you can do lots of trials and tests, and when it's not working, you're not going to release it on the market, because guess what? If you do, people die, and we know that. Same thing with medicine. If you've got a product which is a pill or whatever kind of bit of medicine, of course you have sort of focus groups and so on and so on, and then again the liability question. So that's what I would kind of wonder, is if there is any chance to think through what that means in terms of occupational safety and health, and then to integrate that into our conceptualizations around safety, because so far for me that's been a bit missing. And then one of the ways of doing that is because we can think through responsible by design. So I'm kind of trying to think creatively. Actually, I published a bit on that with someone in the commission, if anybody's curious. So I think our ideas are around thinking through responsible safety and then what that means in terms of already existing law, because I think the creativity around actually how the US have done this is to look at disability law, is to look at inequality law, and then think through what is AI in terms of this supposed technology that has such powerful force in the domains across society at all kind of different levels. So that's the kind of point I wanted to make, and it's just something that I'm quite curious to continue that kind of conversation, especially when it comes to safety and health and workers. So,
Thank you. Interesting. Yes, Sophie.
I was just going to make one point as a follow-up from brilliant comments. I missed your name, so, which is actually there is a question here about the responsibility of employers if we're speaking specifically about the place of work and the relationship between employee and employer, and the deployment of, in this instance, AI. To what end? Is it for a single bottom line, or are there wider responsibilities that employers and organisations ought to hold? In the old days, people used to build places like Bourneville. Is this generation's version of that question about the role and purpose of corporate activity in society and responsibility? Because actually, if the responsibility is only to the bottom line, one might say actually it's fine to have very fluid working arrangements that don't accrue benefits, because actually that reduces the overall head cost of employment. But actually, ought that to be the case? And there's already really interesting work around stakeholder capitalism. There's the Better Business Act work that's being done by colleagues elsewhere. Actually, sewing that together with this conversation is really important. The point was made at one of the fringes that actually Anna and others in the room attended, was made by Helen Margetts from Oxford and also Turing Institute, which is the vertical nature of our conversations. And it strikes me here again, we've had 2 or 3 examples of how there are answers, at least living in other disciplines, but for the fact that we're not tying them together, we're not really making the most of that opportunity. But I do think fundamentally, if you're talking about the sort of the partnership between public and private, this conversation about the role of corporate enterprise and its responsibility and how that works in partnership with its people, I think it sits at the heart of this.
Very interesting. Right, I've got Kester's coming in with some online contributions, I believe, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, so just one of the uses of technology. So one of our APPG members is up in St Andrews at the moment, is talking about how they've done Europe-wide studies in public trust in technologies. And so just kind of offering some input into that, because a lot of the panel had mentioned about the idea of trust. And then we've got Jake from Tech UK asking about the scope of safety in terms of the AI Safety Summit. Does it encompass economic security and safety, and then out of that to bring in skills explicitly, or does it remain focused on the high-level risk and not really perform that kind of central wider function? So there are real questions around how that summit, how that is going to function in terms of the Safety Institute.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson Wall from the Chartered Institute of Personnel. We've actually had a conversation with senior HR people about this very question about investing in AI for organizational benefits, workplace benefits. And they came back and said that they felt incredibly responsible for the impact it has on their workforce, not just now, but over the life cycle of the technology. What they are concerned about is that they actually don't know those risks, and they are concerned that without any guidance or regulation or some kind of gating, that they, as organizations, bear the responsibility for the harm done to their staff for decades to come. So, it's like you introduce technology, it has immediate positive impact, but then unbeknownst to you, because you hadn't considered it, in 5 years' time, you find that actually somebody has been, exited from the organization because an algorithm has said they're not productive according to certain metrics. And later on, you may find that the legislation on equality and disability so on are unable to track some of these harms in future. And so for organizations, they are in a bind. They're trying to do this productivity thing. They're trying to improve the quality of work, but they actually have very little sight of the long-term harms that some of these technologies can bring. And this is one of the things that they raised with us as a professional institute, to say, guide us. And we're going, guide you? I mean, like how? So there is, to your point, there needs to be a much broader conversation, a much broader partnership, and not just within specific professional groups, where you look only at specific risks that you're familiar with. So, I mean, I don't know the answer. I mean, I'm grateful for the panel's conversation about safety, but we are too, as a professional body, in a bind, because we don't know that our guidance will hold for 10 years.
Thank you. I'll come to you, Rachel, but I'll take the woman in the front there.
My name's Sarah Ali. I'm an independent cultural communications advisor, and I work in the private and public sector. I am surprised how many times I'm asked questions that really are based on questions that haven't been centered around the global south, women, minorities, disability. And I think the quality of the questions are sometimes so far away from the decision makers that this is the reason, to your point, all of you actually, I really appreciate everything that I've heard. And at the risk of sort of talking myself out of the job, I don't think that it's necessary to hire people like me if in the beginning or in the early stages of decisions like this, we're reminded about the responsibility and the privilege of the United Kingdom. Not only are we affecting, on a national level, but with the Commonwealth, we've got a responsibility to countries in Africa. And so conversations around ecosystems, they mean something completely different. There were a conversation around rights, they mean something completely different to countries that are bestowed upon us, but yet they have no say. And then the irony, to your point, is kind of about what you were talking about, visas. These are the very countries that, the best that they have to offer the United Kingdom need to find the funds to come and study and qualify in a country like this. But then, I have the privilege of sitting with decision makers, and I know that so many government contracts are outsourced to the Middle East and Africa, and I shouldn't really say that, but I guess it's too late. But it's how ironic is it that we're outsourcing to the very countries that have to qualify and beg and plead and fill out forms that don't make sense because they were filled out by people that don't understand why they're doing the job that they're doing to solve a problem that they don't know why exists, because they don't listen to the people that care the most about the privilege of working in a building like this. And so I guess I just did a long rant, but it pains me that it's actually not complicated, but we must remember the privilege that we have. And when we talk about good work, it's sort of good for who? And when we talk about risk and opportunity, our opportunities often at the risk of countries that are very high in minerals and assets, but low in GDP. And for that reason, they don't have a voice. And unfortunately, the United Nations and the SDGs are not listening, and they're not listening enough. And we need to do better. And I think we need to stop pretending like we don't understand, because we do, and we're just ignoring it. And that must change. And I think that needs, beyond regulation, it needs common sense and empathy and more diversity, not in a tick boxing element, but just as a basic thing that I have to go through on an everyday level. Facial recognition, security, things like that get in my way of me doing my job on an everyday basis. And I'm a British citizen, but yet I have more opportunities to be employed, to solve problems created by Britain, by applying for jobs in the Middle East, for me to come back and talk about them back home. And thank you for this opportunity. It's been a privilege listening to where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Rachel.
So firstly, I just want to say, as I'm coming after you, I absolutely agree with everything you said, and I think the point about mineral extraction and the flow of value is hugely important and under-addressed, and I think it's, you know, it's important it's been brought up. And in quite a different point, one of the things I think we've not worked out how to do is be honest about when things go wrong. And I think in the workplace particularly, liabilities are so complex that actually if you're deploying new technology, new systems, things will go wrong and we will have to learn from that. But culturally, we tend to smooth over and move on. And that actually, I think there's a really interesting possibility around what is that sandbox opportunity for saying in a no-fault way, this has happened and we're learning how to be transparent and honest and open. Because if such and such a thing has happened in a business over here, it's probably happening over here and over here and over here. But what's likely to happen is it won't become known until each of those issues has grown and multiplied. And I suppose what I'm wondering is there a safe space almost to share and learn, and how might that be enabled?
That prompted a thought for me around aircraft safety, where, of course, one of the fundamental ways in which we've built up safety in aircraft over the years is by that openness around when there's an accident, there's a proper kind of investigation about what goes wrong, and that's taken up and learned from. So if we're bringing in that kind of safety approach, I think that having that openness and sharing those zones, I think is really important.
There's a great comment in the second reading debate on the online safety bill in the House of Lords by Rick Allen, Lord Allen of Hallam, aka, where Rick talked about airline safety, but he also talked about road safety, and kind of said in regulatory terms, you do have choices. Airline safety, we have a regulatory approach which has a zero tolerance of accident and mortality. And so there is a highly risk-averse approach, and there is all the openness you talked about. On the roads, we're trading off freedom and liberty and tolerate a really large amount of fatality and accident. But we kind of accept that, and we accept a certain amount of individual responsibility, but there is still regulation around motor vehicles, around some aspects of safety. And you kind of pick your place on that spectrum, and there's probably somewhere beyond cars too. Electric vehicles maybe, but we're about to deal with those. Or pedicabs, we're about to deal with those. It's very exciting. And I think that's helpful. And I suppose my take on all of this is, look, we've got a 30-year productivity problem in this country. We've got a real problem around an unfundable state and an economy that's not working. This is an opportunity to grow the economy, but it's not an opportunity without issues and without potential harms, and without real harms that are happening now. And have we got a parliament, a regulatory structure, and a public that's agile enough to respond quickly enough so that we can realise some of the opportunity, because this is not going away, and some of the opportunity to do things better and to empower people and to remodel work itself is interesting. It's a prize, but it's one we've got to find a way of going into eyes wide open with this kind of discussion and debate, not extending the gap between the haves and have-nots. So working much harder and not having elite conversations, but having open conversations, but being really agile. And government is not this government, just every government is not. And that requires a different set of thinking about how we regulate, which is not without challenge. Sorry.
May I come in on this just as a fellow regulator and legislator in the room? I think it's just worth drawing out, isn't it, the sort of nested pyramid actually of how legislation, regulation and guidance ought to work together. And if I may, I just wanted to pick up a couple of the points that were made. So, for example, your point about safety by design and the role of the HSE. I happen to be reasonably familiar with the Health and Safety Executive, but also Tech UK's point about economic security, and then the sorry, was it CIP or CIPD? CIPD. Exactly. Yes, exactly. CIPD's point about your type of guidance, because there is a legitimate space for these three different layers. Indeed, it might be four if you want to start with principles, followed by overarching legislation, followed by regulation, and then followed by informal guidance. And the CIPD is, of course, absolutely free to continue giving informal guidance. That's what you do. That's what your members ask you to do. You ought to be able to continue to do so in this kind of environment, although I acknowledge it's difficult. I'm not saying that's an easy task, but there is a legitimate role for that type of guidance. And legislators, I don't think, would try to take that away, if you like, from professional bodies. That continues to be a very valid community type of function that is asked for. But I think, just to echo the point that has been made in the AI white paper and that's been repeated many times, the sort of grand scheme here, the grand idea here, is to be able to use regulation, because it is faster. To Jim's point, it is more agile, to use that to be able to do a number of things, including but not limited to some of the existing current harms that many have highlighted in today's debate and elsewhere. And that is in part because you want to be able to be sector specific, but it's also in part because you acknowledge that legislation, that other rung in the pyramid, is a slower type of vehicle. Necessarily, because everybody would scream if it was done too quickly and not with enough scrutiny, right? So it is natural and sort of legitimate that it takes some time to do. So what you will see is regulators, I hope, coming forward in the first instance with sensible strands of what should be their pre-existing work. They're not being asked to do something radically new here. They're being asked to take into their stride a technology that already applies to the areas which they are already responsible for. And it's that I just wanted to use to make the point about the HSE. I fully expect the HSE to be one of those regulators that can do that. I expect all regulators in the next 12 months actually to have something to say in this area, and we should all collectively be looking for that, I think. But the HSE, I certainly hope, would take that challenge that you articulate quite rightly about product safety. It is not beyond the wit of man to work out how to do that, and they ought to do so. That is then those were all sort of, milestones on the journey potentially towards other legislation that may be needed. I personally subscribe to the argument that it's too early to articulate what other legislation may be needed, because actually you have to go through those other layers first, drive out what remains, and then potentially you put that together in law. The final point I just wished to make was not to forget how many offences, how many crimes, the really major things that we mind about in society are already defined. In fact, there's very few that aren't already defined. You perhaps struggle to answer the challenge of is there a major evil that can be done that is not yet defined anywhere in law or regulation. That would be an interesting exercise. So my point is this: you need to use those existing crimes and definitions and draw on regulators to apply them. And I think that is the kind of field that we are in at the moment.
In passing over to Matt, I would just comment, Chloe, that I think you're quite right about regulation, but I think Parliament needs to update its regulatory process.
Indeed, there is that.
Because for those, this is a very boring parliamentary point, but regulation is tabled in the House of Commons normally, and the scrutiny of it is extremely limited, and it is whipped. So the government always wins. Then it comes to the Lords, where by convention we don't overturn the will of the Commons. So there isn't really a point in the regulatory process for it to be amended. And that's problematic in this area.
May I add to that, Chair, before you move on from that point? It's actually slightly bigger than that even, because I think we're probably using regulation to mean two things interchangeably. One is secondary legislation. You're quite right, that's the thing. You've described the process. But that's not all of it, is it? You will have regulators who actually are able to bring forth basically guidance books, and they do so quite regularly. I think we are using one word to mean both of those things, and it would help us to be more specific.
And if we can get the regulators with that other function to have a cooperation and the ability to share some of their powers and some of their sanctions, that would also be helpful. Matt?
Yes, just to come back in on that, because I think what Chloe's just outlined is kind of the prize, right? It's the vision of the white paper, and I think if that can work in practice, that's fantastic. But I think there are a few things that need to happen in order to make that actually work in practice. And one thing is giving regulators the tools. Regulators really vary in terms of their powers. You have some, like the ICO, for example, with a lot of relevant powers to interrogate AI systems, to request data, to levy large fines on companies, and really shape the behavior of actors in this ecosystem. But some relevant regulators, the EHRC, for example, is incredibly relevant to this. A lot of the issues we've talked about today in terms of AI harms are effectively equality and fairness issues. The EHRC doesn't have very many powers at all, right? It can basically just put a PDF up on its website. Don't quote me on that. And there's dozens of regulators that are going to be expected to regulate AI, and they don't all have the powers they need. Certainly not, again, as I mentioned earlier, to engage with the developers of these systems. So there's potentially a need to legislate to give regulators the tools, and then they can apply them in a context-based and agile way. And actually, this is the issue with the Data Protection Bill, right? It kind of strips back and removes some of those tools. But also resourcing is really important. Again, some regulators, if you look at the leading kind of digital regulation cooperation forum regulators, have the resources, have the skills, have the talent to engage on AI. Others won't, and that's a problem because these issues are going to arise across the economy in different sectors, including ones overseen by quite small regulators without the staff and resources. And some areas, we've talked about the future of work and employment today. Employment is not comprehensively regulated, right? There is no employment regulator monitoring, every recruitment process or every kind of employment contract. And God knows we probably wouldn't want that. Some people might. But then that's a real gap in terms of the white paper approach. It's not really clear who is going to plug that gap. So, I think what Chloe outlined is a great vision and a really pragmatic one, but not all the components are there yet.
I've got 5 minutes left. Any final, very brief comments from anybody? Crikey. Yeah.
Can I just underline something, Natasha, you said earlier, and it jumped to mind when you talked about agility. And I do think it is worth underlining the point that agility implies responsiveness rather than necessarily driving the shape of something. So being in response rather than leading. I do think you might want to combine agility with deliberative design. What is it that we're seeking to achieve? Outcomes-focused description of what good looks like, so outcomes rather than designing the picture necessarily, and being able to ensure that we get there. And the reason I mentioned that is because I think one of the panelists at least mentioned this very briefly, which is, I think actually, Jenny, you might have in the fair transition piece that you mentioned, because there is a promise of greater productivity, and obviously we're all very familiar with the sort of stagnant nature of UK productivity rates and so on. But there is a time frame and there is a lag to get there, and there is a considerable mind the gap problem in the generation that we have in the workforce now, the generation that is halfway through its working life. There are still incredibly productive people who may or may not fit into the world in which we have a very different skills need. And actually that gap, there are all sorts of societal implications of people with no purpose that are beyond the necessary conversation that we have around here, but it's absolutely relevant to parliamentary debate, I would have thought.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us about responsiveness and the implication of agility and leadership. And I guess that in the end it goes to some political choices that are made, not necessarily party political, but political choices, which are, we can carry on believing that the private sector will be the drivers of innovation and growth and our future prosperity, and then we just have to regulate them when they get out of hand. Or we can go, yeah, but we've also got to move to a more equitable, more sustainable economy and world, and that requires leadership. So how are we going to use the power of government to lead them into where we want them to go? Got up two final comments, and Chloe might want a final comment. No, you don't. So I think is it Natasha and I've lost your name in my little notes here, but yeah, Heather.
Well, actually, the only thing I would have added is that just on the summit, like the thing that made the news was Elon Musk. Yes. You know, his like, none of us are going to need to work. And I have to say, I felt like going out on the streets and saying that that's not a future that I want for me, my kids, or their kids. And that the fact that that kind of was just left there hanging as a sort of, oh yeah, that's the future we all should aspire to. So the future of work should be that we're working in good work.
So I wrote down here the existential threat to work satisfaction. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. And in fact, you know, one of the things that we talk about a lot more is skills gaps and jobs we can't fill. So engineering is a key area for that, but also science teachers in state schools. So if you've got a young person facing their GCSEs without a science teacher, then you can't hope that they will have a really important and valuable job in the AI sector. So I think we need to think about those job shortages, those skills shortages, as well as the effect on jobs people have.
I could go on a rant about design and technology teachers as well, but I won't. Thank you all very much. That was a thoroughly interesting discussion. Anna, do you want to say anything in closing?
So echo what Jim has said about thank you. Take some actions as the Secretariat, perhaps a letter to the Safe AI Sensitivity Institute on remit, and to pick up work on the data protection and digital information bills, to flag some work that we've already done and is ongoing in this space, including digital information principles at work. So looking to where we want to go, where we're headed, and in terms of Rachel's important point about a safe space where we can learn together, highlight some work being done by my absent colleague and co-director Abby Gilbert on a sandbox where we're hoping to practice and pilot and share others with you, we hope.
Thank you very much. See you again soon. Sometime.